And welcome, Dr. Brittany Cooper. Thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate you spending the time talking with myself and our students. I think that they'll really get a lot out of this Q&A that we have today. But before we get started on the Q&A, I just kind of wanted to ask you, what your background is and how did you get involved in prevention science?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Nate. And I should probably introduce Sam, who's going to be, I'm sure, in and out of the screen as we talk. He tends to get excited especially when I'm talking loud, which I guess I tend to do when I'm online. I don't know. But yeah, to your question. So I think back to, my interests originally in undergrad were around psychology. I think a lot of us prevention scientists start there. And I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do with psychology. I thought I wanted to probably do some kind of one-on-one work as a counselor, family therapist. And the first thing I learned was, one, that there was a whole field called at my institution at University of Arizona, where we went for undergrad, called family studies. I think they started out as family studies and then eventually added human development. So it's family studies and human development. And I remember I was looking through the course catalog, because you had a physical catalog when I was in undergrad. I'm flipping through this thick course catalog and came across these classes in human development. And I found them, the descriptions, just fascinating. So it was just really about how individuals become who they are and how their families influence them and how their communities influence them. And so I took that class, I think, my freshman semester, my first semester. And that opened up a whole new world to me, because, the world of psychology, a lot of the classes I was taking were more focused on not all of them, but on abnormal psychology. So how do people develop disorders? And that was interesting to me, but I was more interested in broader how just humans develop in general and normatively. And it felt more attuned with, I guess, the way I was looking at the world. So that was I think, the origins of it. When I started to learn there was a whole field that focused on that. And then ultimately, I still thought maybe I'd go into some kind of helping profession. My senior year in college, I did 2 different internships to try to get an on-the-ground view of what that kind of work would be like. One was shadowing a social worker. One was shadowing a school psychologist. And in both of those cases, I kind of felt and learned through just observing how tough that work was, really, how emotionally exhausting it was, and how a lot of times you'd be working with a youth and never interacting with their families, rarely. And these youth you'd see for maybe an hour a week, and then send them back off to their communities, their families. And it felt like it was a lot of fits and starts, 2 steps forwards, 4 steps back sometimes. And I just started to learn that it felt like that wasn't where my heart was. It felt like that work was critically needed, obviously. But a lot of these kids, unfortunately, had a lot of struggles already for a long time. So how to interrupt that and change course. It felt a little bit too hard for my own kind of what I was looking for in my profession, my career. So I started to try to think, well, can't we address these problems earlier on? Aren't there approaches that could be broader, more group-based, or other approaches where we're maybe having a bigger impact? And I didn't know the word. I might have known the word prevention, but I certainly did not know the word prevention science. Didn't know it existed. And I think it was a combination of talking with my mentor, who I was doing research at the time in the family studies department with a colleague, or with a faculty member there, who ended up becoming a colleague. So I kind of think of her as a colleague now, Jennifer Maggs. And she said, number one, you need to do research if you want to develop prevention programs, because that's kind of what I had started to envision. And I had been doing research and I thought, oh, this is a good experience, but I didn't think I wanted to do that for a career, because I wanted to help people. So, but she was like, no, you do research in order to develop the knowledge base and to understand what works to prevent these problems from occurring. So it was that, along with Google searching or whatever it was at the time, that I came across the Society for Prevention Research, and then kind of through that, figured out that there were programs that weren't called prevention science, but that housed researchers who were doing prevention science work. So that's a really long answer, I guess, to that question. But it was kind of just, one thing led to another. And once I started reading about prevention science, it just felt like, oh, that's it. That's what I want to do. And then I went from there. So.
That's great. It's really interesting. I think when you ask prevention scientists how they got into the field, it's often a long answer, right? It's taking those long and winding roads. And it's funny that you mentioned that you were interested in psychology to begin with. And that was where I started as well, and was a psychology major at the University of Washington, where our mutual advisor, Dr. Mark Greenberg, was at the time. And he took a position at Penn State, and he said, "Hey, Nate, I think you'd be a better fit in human development family studies. That's my perception of your interests." And sure enough, it was just a great place to be. Graduate school is a great place to be, and we both had a great advisor. And I think that we should mention that Brittany, you're now the chair of the graduate programs at the prevention science program at Washington State University. So any students who are interested in going on to a PhD and doing research in prevention science, be sure to check out the program at WSU. Yeah. We should also mention that Brittany is now on the board of directors for the Society for Prevention Research, where it all kind of started.
Where it all started, yeah, it's pretty cool.
Great. So, I guess one question that I have for you is that, the Institute of Medicine has provided us with our current framework for the scope of prevention. Right. Can you describe to us what the key differences are among universal, selective, and indicated prevention programs or approaches, and why they shouldn't be considered competing and rather complementary?
Yeah, great. So I know the visual that the IOM puts together is kind of like a spectrum, like it looks like a rainbow. I really like, especially when we're talking about just the prevention kind of component, I like thinking of it as a triangle or a pyramid. And the reason is it kind of helps me think through how they're connected, and also to think through hopefully the reach of each of them, or where they should be targeted. So for universal, I think, okay, that's the bottom of the triangle. It's the biggest segment, because with universal prevention, what you're really trying to do is target an entire population. So the hope is that you would, offer a program to, let's say, an entire population of fifth graders or something. So you kind of have to define the boundaries of what the population is, but it is aimed at, regardless of anything, exposure to risk or not, we think there's some benefit to all individuals within that population to receive some prevention skills and build capacities. So that's really about getting to folks before any problems target problems exist, and just targeting the entire population. So then you move up, the middle part of the triangle is the selected component. And that's, again, smaller segment, but still fairly large, where you're trying to identify folks that have some level of risk. So they've been exposed to some kind of risk, according to the research, would put them at an elevated risk. It's not going to, it's not deterministic. It's not going to definitely result in a problem, but it increases their risk. And so you want to target that population, that middle segment. So that's getting to people where maybe they haven't fully developed a problem, but there is exposure to some kind of risk. So we could think of something like family conflict. So some level of family conflict is normative, but on average, if people tend to have more family conflict in their home, the youth in that home have a higher risk of developing a variety of problems. So maybe we target intervention or prevention program towards that group. And then we get to the top of the triangle, that's the smallest piece. because hopefully that's the smallest number of individuals, because those are the individuals who have some detectable signs of whatever it is the problem is that you're trying to prevent. So they're kind of past that stage of just being exposed to risk, but actually start to have signs of developing a particular problem. And that's the group that you're trying to target with indicated prevention. I think that answers your question mostly.
Yeah. So, I can imagine that having an integrated approach where you have, where needed, universal prevention programs, selective prevention programs, and indicated prevention programs would be ideal, right? But oftentimes communities may not have the resources to have each of those approaches implemented. So I'm wondering, for our practitioners in the audience, and some folks who may need to choose one or two among the three approaches, what are your recommendations for how practitioners can do that?
Yeah, this is a hard question, I think, Nate, actually. So there are a couple of different ways to look at it, I think, especially as someone, I haven't necessarily been that community provider having to make that decision, but I've worked with folks in that situation. Some of it is around kind of cost, right? So how much funding, how many resources do you have to devote to whatever it is you are trying to prevent? And from a theoretical standpoint, there's perspective, and not just theoretical, but from a research kind of empirical standpoint. I like to think a lot about, it's actually called the prevention paradox. So it is a paradox to think about it, and that's why it's important to understand. So Jeffrey Rose, who is an epidemiologist and did a lot of work more in kind of physical health, so like heart disease, prevention of heart disease or diabetes. He was able to show through his work that, and I'm going to read the quote because I don't want to get it wrong, a large number of people exposed to a small risk may generate many more cases than a small number of people exposed to a high risk. So translating that basically means that universal prevention, being targeted at an entire population who are many of them at relatively small risk, you could have a larger impact in the long run if you target that number of people, increasing their skills and capacities, and really shifting the distribution. So not to get like too technical or statsy, but if you have your bell curve and you have like the mean, what you're really trying to do is shift an entire mean population downward if that thing is bad, right? And if you do that, you're going to have a larger impact in terms of the numbers. That's one way to think about it, but I also want to recognize too that sometimes it takes longer and it's harder to demonstrate that impact because those people are at lower risk. So if you're kind of working in a space where you have to demonstrate impact, quantitatively, for instance, that's easier to do when you're working with groups that are at higher risk to start. And even especially in the indicated population. So it's something to consider. But again, like in my heart of hearts, my response is the majority of our resources should go towards universal or more primary prevention programs, because in the long run, that is going to have the largest impact. And we often, as prevention scientists, we're thinking on a population or a community level. And I think that that's another reason that those universal approaches, I think, are where we go to first. And of course, if you do a good job at your universal prevention program, then there's going to be fewer people that do develop those problems later on that are going to need those more intensive, more costly, usually, interventions later on.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's a great point. That the implementation of universal interventions, prevention programs, can reduce the cost burden and the burden of care later on down the road. Yeah, that's great. So as we mentioned, you and I were both trained at Penn State as developmental scientists, and can you tell our students why a developmental approach to prevention science is so important?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is another thing that comes up when I get the question sometimes, especially as director of the PhD program, about what's the difference between public health and prevention science. And I think this is one of the main areas where at least our emphasis on development is much greater in prevention science than in public health. And I think the advantage to that is that, where a lot of many of the prevention scientists started is that they were trying to understand, at what point or, what is the developmental course of this particular problem that develops. And just as an example, because I'm more familiar with it, I'll use substance use and maybe specifically alcoholism. So like you don't just wake up one day and suddenly you're an alcoholic, right? It develops over time. There are things or experiences that you have over time that result in or increase the chances that you will develop a substance use disorder. And as a prevention scientist, I want to understand what that developmental path looks like. And I can look at both my understanding of normative development and compare it to groups of individuals where they do develop problems and where are the differences. I can also look at normative development to tell me, like, for instance, if I look at and understand how the brain is developing over time and how substances kind of impact the brain, kind of what are the mechanisms by which someone develops a problem. Some of that is neurological. And I know that brain development continues into the early 20s. So that leads me to believe, like, okay, well, if I want to intervene and prevent someone's actual brain from the impacts of substances, then I need to delay the onset of substance use. So if I know that, then especially, research that tells us, and I can't remember the exact age, but it's like if you start drinking before the age of 14 or maybe it's 12, there's just a much, much greater likelihood that you're going to develop a problem later on. So that tells me the timing, when I need to intervene to some extent. Okay, well, I need to delay onset and I need to get to these youth before they start using potentially. And then I start to look at their context and try to layer on and understand what are the risk and protective factors at different levels. Like, there are different characteristics of an individual that put them at higher risk. For instance, if they have a temperament that is more sensation seeking, they're just more prone to seek out thrilling experiences. My 4-year-old is like that, so I know what that looks like as a young child. And, again, like, that doesn't mean he's going to develop a problem, but that means that certain experiences that he have might impact him differently. And he might seek out different experiences than his peers that don't have that temperamental trait. So that tells me kind of at the individual level, what are some of the risk and protective factors? And then, what is going on in the environment, in the family, in the community, also similarly, that can increase risk or reduce or increase protection. So all of those factors together and kind of understanding the timing of when those factors become most relevant, most important, can lead me to understand both the development of that developmental path of that problem and when do we intervene and in what way do we intervene? What risk and protective factors do I want to be paying close attention to at different developmental stages? So that's where I think we have a leg up on public health folks who don't necessarily get that kind of developmental training.
Right, absolutely, great. So you mentioned those risk and protective factors, and that risk and protective factor approach to prevention has really been the bedrock of the last 30 to 50 years of prevention science and prevention science implementation and program development. More recently, a couple of other what I consider to be complementary frameworks, including resilience and social emotional competence approaches, have entered the picture. And so, I guess, can you tell our students what are the advantages of those frameworks, and should they be considered competing approaches to the risk and protective factor approach?
Yeah, so as soon as you asked this question, and I did get it ahead of time, it makes me think of mean, there's lots of writing on this, but one article in particular that Rico Catalano, David Hawkins, and colleagues published in the early 2000s, where they asked this question, like, are these competing or cooperative frameworks? Because at the time there was a lot of tension in the field, and they specifically were talking about the positive youth development kind of field or framework versus prevention science. And I think they argue really well in this article and create a compelling case that, in fact, they are not competing. You know, at the root of it, they evolved and developed or they have similar roots. In other words, they have similar goals, really, right? And they might use different language, slightly different perspectives, but in the end, they are aiming to do the same thing, promote healthy development and prevent the development of problems. And those things go hand in hand. There's another person in the positive youth development field, Karen Pittman, who in the early 1990s, you know, is famous for this quote of problem free is not fully prepared. So just because you're able to prevent the development of these really serious problems doesn't mean a youth is fully prepared to, you know, meet their fullest potential, if you will. So you need to both be reducing risk and enhancing protective factors, and they also use the term developmental assets and you know, just increasing skills. Those things together are where you're going to see the biggest impact. So I think it's a little bit of it is about just kind of your approach and your perspective. But if you think about it holistically and what the ultimate goal is, they really should be used complementary, like you said. And some of the kind of distinctions started to happen a lot too, because when prevention science first got started, I think just naturally, because it was early in its beginning of the field, like they started by looking at single problems. So I want to prevent alcoholism. I want to prevent delinquency. I want to prevent, you know, and they had to pick an outcome, one outcome. And that really, I mean, it was out of necessity to some extent. It was out of restriction or, you know, meeting certain funding agencies, research funding agencies, you know, goals. And it kind of siloed things a little bit. But over time, the field has become much more sophisticated in understanding. Really, it's about, there are lots of common risk or shared risk and protective factors. So if we really focus in on those as mechanisms or mediators, we have a much greater chance of preventing a whole host of problems and promoting a whole host of good things, positive things. And that's where I think that if we focus in on those common risk and protective factors, then it's really easy to see how they're complementary instead of competing.
That's great. Great. So thank you, Dr. Cooper. That was the last question I had for you. Do you have any parting words for our students?
Yeah, well, I'm just excited for you. I think that, I mean, you obviously have found this field already, and you're interested and excited about pursuing additional education in it. And I think that the work that you all will be doing on the ground is just so meaningful and important. And I'm excited for you to be able to start applying some of these principles in your work. I think that's what's so fantastic about the field of prevention science, and many of us get drawn to this field because of the direct translation, you know, from like, what does the research say? How do I understand the development of this problem, and how can I actually do something about it? So I think most of us, I'm going to speak for, you know, an entire field, but a lot of us in prevention science, even though we're doing research, we're driven and we have our passion in prevention science because of how it can be applied ultimately in the real world. And that's the work that you all are doing. And so we're just grateful for the work that you do, because it really is a partnership and a collaboration. And so good luck. And yeah, check out our PhD program if you find that you actually want to do more research in this area and learn more. So thanks so much for having me, Nate.
Of course. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
All right.